Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Use the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. I'm going to text my son and ask him to stop yelling from the basement. Welcome, welcome. Kirkland, Minneapolis, North Seattle, Brooklyn, New York. Oh, headed to France. Fun. Paris. Yes, David. Hello. Denver. Welcome. We'll let a few more people get logged in and then we and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop in Seattle that's called Book Larder. And in normal times, we do lots of author talks and cooking classes in the shop. And during the pandemic, and I think probably going forward, we have taken our author talks to Zoom. And one of the really great things about that is that we are able to welcome authors like today's author, Alec Lobrano, and have him talk with someone like David Lebovitz when they are on the other side of the world. And we also get to have so many of you from all over the world join us. So thank you so much for being here. I'm so delighted to welcome Alec as we talk about his memoir, My Place at the Table. It is really delightful, and I think a really great way also to kick off Pride Month, though a great read any time of year. He is going to be in conversation with David Lebovitz, his friend and fellow Parisian, and they are going to talk about the book. They will leave time for questions. So if you can please just use that Q&A button. If you have questions, that will make it a little bit easier for me to keep track of those. The book is, of course, available at booklarder.com, and I will put a link in the chat so that you can purchase that from Book Larder or hopefully an independent bookstore if you decide that you would like to have a copy. And if you could just please use the chat to talk to each other. And like I said, just use that Q&A button for your questions. That will be really helpful. All right, so without further ado, please welcome Alec Lobrano and David Lebovitz.
Hello, Laura, Alec.
Hi, David. Hi, Laura.
How are you?
Good.
Well, we lost Laura, but before we start, I just want to thank Laura for putting us together because it's always nice to see you. But I haven't seen you in a few months. But Laura has really, truly one of the best bookstores I've ever been in. And every time I go to Seattle, I try to do an event there. And I'm so distracted because you're in this room with all these amazing cookbooks. Laura is selling copies of My Paris at the Table that are signed by Alec. So if you want to get a copy, please feel free to contact the store afterwards, or you can order through their website. It's a great bookstore once again, and I love it. So I want to welcome my friend Alec Lobrano. And Alec, we're both in France right now. I can see, is it raining in your neighborhood?
I'm down south at the moment, so no, we have a beautiful sunny day down outside of Uzès. I'll be back in Paris. Well, I'll see you next week when I come back to Paris.
Okay, what do you miss when you're not in Paris?
Asian food, desperately, which is why we're going to have an Asian lunch next Wednesday.
It's funny because Asian food is one of the heroes of the lockdown, like delivery movement, because nobody really wants like steak frite delivered, but you want like Asian noodles or dumplings. They work really well.
I think all small folded edible objects make people happy, whatever culture they originate in, whether they're tortellini or gyoza or pierogi. Every culture has something like that, and I could eat my own weight in them and have.
Yes, I know. All I want to eat are dumplings now. But Alec has written two other books, I believe, Hungry for Paris and Hungry for France. Hungry for Paris is how I met Alec. It's a book about the restaurants of Paris. It's kind of a guidebook, but I want to use that term sort of loosely because it's every entry has a story about the restaurant, a personal story, what makes it special. It's not just here's some addresses, go there. Hungry for France is the same theme. It's more of a picture book with beautiful color pictures. And it captures all of France. And I actually don't, I'm not just saying this because Alec is in front of us, but I don't think I know anybody who knows, whoops, my light just went off. I don't think anybody I know knows France as well as Alec, knows French cuisine, what's really happening in France, and especially in Paris. I'm sorry, I just got sidetracked by my light going off. But you finally wrote a memoir, and it's called My Place at the Table. It just came out 2 days ago, correct?
It was published on June 3rd, exactly.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Or no, June 1st, what am I saying? It's 2 days old. I'm still postpartum with the book, so I'm a little disappointed. As you know, it's a strange feeling to put a book out into the world. It's so, I mean, in the virtual world we've been living in during the pandemic, it's become even more virtual. When I was going out the other day for the first time in a long time, I had to go to Nîmes to do something, and I got dressed up. And when I opened the door, the wonderful post lady was there, and she sort of drew back and she went, "Wow, you look great when you get dressed." In other words, the flannel pajama bottoms and the t-shirts, which is how we've all been living for the last year and a half.
Well, somebody told me to write a memoir, which I did once. I said as soon as I finished, I said, I'm never doing that again. And then, of course, I wrote another one now, and I've said I've never do that again. Sorry, my light's going to go off. Do I look okay? Is it too dark? I'm sorry, my light keeps going off here. It's not a live, it's not a Zoom unless there's a tech glitch. But I guess I'll just keep, you can see half of my face. So how's that? So you wrote this memoir and you talked about a lot of things, and you, as they say, cut a vein. But one of the great things about writing a book about your life in Paris is you get to answer that age-old question. You've been here 30 years.
That's right.
And it's, why did you move to Paris? And normally I would just tell people, buy the book, but I want to hear it from you. The book goes into it in detail, but tell us just a little bit about your story.
Well, I'll give you two very brief, I mean, the seed was planted. I had an aunt who worked in book publishing in New York City, and she gave me a series of books which were the story of a brother and sister in Norway, in Holland, in France, in Italy, and whatever. The French book had the kids getting on a train at the Gare de Lyon, a night train to go and spend their school vacation with their grandparents who owned a hotel in Nice. Within the first 2 pages of the opening of this book, which I read until the pages fell out, the children were ushered into a dining car where they had asparagus with freshly made hollandaise sauce, roast beef, Porto mushroom sauce, a frozen peach parfait. I mean, I'm reading this, in the snowy wastes of a New England winter, and I couldn't even imagine food that delicious. What the message I took away from that was the possible idea that France was the place where everything was delicious. And then finally, when my mother, late mother, who I'm hugely grateful to, inherited some money, she did something that practical, intelligent people never did, and she decided to spend some of it. So she took us to Europe for a whole summer, and she was a brilliant woman, art historian, and actually very interested in food in spite of herself. And so, she squired my 2 brothers and me all the way through Rome or Italy, Austria, Switzerland, and a cruise on the Rhine. And then we met my father and my sister in Paris. And as soon as we got to Paris, the first thing that I ate was, a croque monsieur.
How old were you?
I was 14.
Okay.
The idea of bechamel sauce on a sandwich lurking under a layer of blistered cheese, and I mean, the sandwich was just shockingly delicious, as was everything else that I ate. And the aesthetics of food, the markets and the way that pastries were packaged, I was overwhelmed by the elegance and the sensuality and the beauty and the love that was obviously ambient in Paris insofar as good food was concerned. And, when we left, I thought to myself with a lump in my throat, I don't know how I'll do it, but I've got to come back here and stay. And so I did.
Okay, but you came through London, right? You didn't
I was,
just, you were in New York and you didn't just move to France.
no, I would lie in my sofa bed when I had a series of badly paid publishing jobs and lived in a studio on Waverly Place
Wait,
across the
publishing
from.
doesn't pay well? Wait.
There's a surprise, right? Um, and I would follow the molding of my studio around in the golden light of the street lamp through the blinds, thinking, how the hell am I ever going to get out of here? So when an opportunity presented itself in London, I had studied in London. That was the first major city I lived in independently. I'd lived there for a year and a half on my own, and I loved it. I mean, I was fascinated by Victorian Britain, so I did a whole school year there. And I thought, well, I'll move to London. At least I'll be on the right side of the Atlantic in terms of my interest in traveling in Europe. There was that thing that the surprise was, in our schoolrooms when we were kids, the map had the United States in the middle of the world. But the reality is the United States is out in right field and a very inconvenient place from which to travel, with the exception of Latin America. So I thought, well, I want France, and I want to travel as much as I possibly can. So London was the start. And as soon as I heard about a job in Paris, improbable casting though that was for me to be a fashion journalist, I knew nothing about fashion. I applied for it and got it. And the rest is all that's all he wrote and that's all he ate.
Well, the time I realized the focus on America shifted to the rest of the world, when America wasn't as esteemed, I guess I'd say, is when the euro and the dollar changed, and all the supermodels who were traveling in Europe and working, they all wanted to get paid in euros. They didn't want dollars anymore. So that was my moment where, okay, Europe is the strength of. So it was my, my barometer was supermodels, not the map. But you actually had become a barometer for French food. And even you were writing for Les Echos, or Les Echos, which Les Echos. I have the South accent. I pronounce the final S, Les Echos, and which is a pretty hard gig to get. Richard Olney, who came before us, was one of these Americans who became very integrated into France and very respected in France. And he wrote for French journals and so forth. And you were writing, and you do write for French journals. That's a pretty big coup. It's a pretty big.
No, it was something that just came. It was after I worked for Gourmet for 10 years, and it was just a little while after it closed, and I was still figuring out what I do next, because I'd had such a great time working with Ruth Rachel and the gang at Gourmet, and the abrupt ending of Gourmet left me sort of on a bicycle in midair, and I started working with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and all the big food magazines. And that was really fun. But then there was this tap on the shoulder from Les Echos. And yeah, I mean, I went to, they told me that they were aware of my writing and that they wanted me to do their restaurant column. And when I got home and told Bruno, my spouse, about it, he said, well, that's very flattering, but he looked quizzical. And I said, why are you, there's something, you're not, I mean, your enthusiasm is sort of conditional here. And he said, will you be writing in English or in French? And I said, well, I guess the best writing in French. And he said to me, and he's right, he said, your spoken French is 90% correct. You speak beautiful French. Your written French is maybe what I would call remedial level in a men's prison in France.
Well, I have to that, I want to say French people make a lot of mistakes when they write. So I see, I get emails from people in French and so forth, and they make mistakes too. So.
Well, they do, and I made many. But what was so hard about it, David, is that for me, I mean, aside from, my subject is food, but food is also my love, that's my subject, but my great love in life is writing and reading. And deprived of my tools, wit and humor,
Yeah.
which are so essential in terms of being an English language writer. It was really hard because I did not want to write factual restaurant reviews. I wanted to write short stories where food was the main character. And that is really what I think they were attracted to that, but it was extremely difficult to try to render that into French. And there was that, and then there was the fact that, you know, hundreds of people in Paris wanted to drive a steak knife into my back because that was one of the most food writing jobs in France. So, you know, many people were looking forward to seeing me flail and fail.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because food has always been sort of a theme of your life. And you talk about it. I think I saw you say in another interview that it's sort of the prism with which you see the world. But we sort of missed a gap. And I just want to let everybody know that, you know, we only have a limited amount of time here. Your whole story is in the book, is in your book that just came out, the details. But you came from London to Paris and you were writing about fashion. And then you switched. You were like, well, I mean, and you dress well. People can't see, you know, what you're wearing. Maybe you're wearing a towel. We were all wearing sweatpants maybe, but when I look at you, I don't think fashion, I think food, because I know you as a food person. So how did you make that transition?
The transition presented itself quite immediately because the first editorial meeting in that office, and it was a not particularly friendly office, when I was called upon out of clear blue sky for a story idea, and I'd only been in Paris for 24 hours and knew no one, and my French was appalling. And I just thought to myself, well, I suppose I could write something about that cheese shop that we went to. My mother took us to the Andouille when it was still in the Rue d'Amsterdam. And it was a restaurant and a cheese shop. And it was Monsieur Andouille who created contemporary French cheese culture by bringing cheeses from all over France to Paris before cheese was a local product. So I suggested that. Nobody had ever heard of it, which astonished me because they'd all lived in Paris for a really long time. And the bureau chief was a wonderful woman from Boston, Krista Worthington, who was really intelligent. And she too, she had aspirations to write about other things. And she said, Alec, that sounds great. Do it. You know, that'd be fun. They did occasionally cover food. So whenever there was a food subject, I would pounce on it. And also secretly, I continued freelancing for some of the British food magazines after Paris too.
Well, one thing that's interesting, the longer I live in Paris, you see a lot of people come and you see a lot of people go over the years, especially this year because of the pandemic. But things have changed a lot. Like, you know, I moved here 20 years ago and the food scene was different than it is today. So I kind of want to talk to you about that because it's a subject that has been talked about over the years, often by people that don't live here, that don't understand France. And there's been some sensationalism about the death of the bistro. Some of it is actually well-merited as well. But what would you say has been the biggest change in French cuisine? And I want to ask you what you think French cuisine is, part of this question. What do you think has been the biggest change you've seen in the last 30 years and maybe the last 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think that when I moved to France, the shape of the food chain was a pyramid. I mean, at the top of the pyramid were all those Michelin's 2 and 3 star things. Then there was another strata, which was la cuisine bourgeoise, which is what Julia Child fell in love with. And those were business restaurants, you know, fancy restaurants. You drop down another level and they were the bistros and then brasseries and then down to like, you know, the other type of bistro. I mean, that's confusing to people because bistro is also a little like a bar or a coffee shop that you go into and just have a sandwich or a salad or something. That was the shape of it now. Now it's flattened out a lot. I mean, when the modern bistro started with Yves Cambibor, in 1994, that was an epic event. It's hugely changed the way that France eats and the way that the world eats too. By all these young chefs, incredibly talented young chefs, were trained in haute cuisine kitchens, but the economics of going out and opening an haute cuisine restaurant had become punitive and impossible. So they took their skills and apply them to bistro cooking, which is what created modern bistro food. And, using the amazing skills and occasionally, very sparingly, luxury produce and things on homely regional recipes created a whole new type of food, a whole new segment of restaurants in Paris, and gave the city enormous energy. And we're still there. I mean, that thing is, it continues to move along and evolve and everything else. And I think that today, I mean, one of the big pieces of news that's happened recently from Paris is that at the end of June, Alain Ducasse's 3-star restaurant is closing at the Plaza Athénée. And I wrote something about it for Airmail News, Graydon Carter's new online digital magazine. And when I interviewed people in Paris, one of them said something really interesting. A concierge, one of the big hotels, he said, when people come now, they don't want that. I cannot force them into that dining room. It's too expensive and it's not fun. They want to go to Septime. They want to go to La Maison. They want to go to the place where they're going to have a good time, eat something absolutely delicious. And they want to go to the place that they've seen on Instagram. So the way that people get their food information, their desires, where they're coming from and everything else is completely changed. I mean, so for me, the creation of the modern bistro is the most important thing that's happened since I've lived here. More recently, I'm elated that Paris is becoming as good an international food city, almost as London or New York, or I wouldn't say Sydney, but it's improved hugely from what it was. I mean, foreign food was anecdotal when I first moved here.
So one of the things that you've talked about is the influence, and this shocks often people that don't understand France or don't know it, don't live here, but the influence of foreign chefs in Paris especially, in France too, and the other cities. But Paris there was for several years, a lot of foreign chefs came here and opened small restaurants. And that had a really big impact. And maybe, how do you what kind of impact do you think that had and why? Because as you know, for a while, a lot of people thought, well, American food is bad. American cooking is bad. Americans don't know how to cook. And then how has that shifted?
Well, it's really interesting because, when Daniel Rose and Braden Perkins were among the first two to come, American chefs to come and start cooking in Paris. And Daniel's first restaurant was in the 9th arrondissement, right near where I live. And
Spring. For those that don't know, it was called Spring Restaurant, and which is a reference nowadays.
And now he's in New York City with a brilliant restaurant called Le Coucou. But when Daniel started the French press and when Braden started the French press, their food was unbelievably delicious. I mean, I wrote a lot about both of them for the New York Times and Saveur and a lot of other people. They had a lot of trouble getting coverage. I mean, it was his local coverage from the French food writers. It was as though nobody could bring themselves to move past the idea that, we wake up and walk into the kitchen and drink a great big cappuccino with a hot dog or a slice of pizza or a taco or a cheeseburger. I mean, there was such a deep unwillingness to admit the possibility that there could be good food coming from the United States. So that was part of it. I think that this influx of foreign talent has made Paris a much more cosmopolitan city. It was, frankly, and people might throw bricks through my windows, but it was provincial because it was so French supremacist. I mean, it was so, based on this idea that the Mont Blanc was of the gastronomic food world, the top of the mountain, it was French and will always be French. Now I think that it's less, it's less hegemonic, and I think that, and yet that being said, the influx of talented young chefs, like that wonderful Mexican chef Beatriz. I mean, there are loads of them. People coming
so many now.
The world from South America and the Middle East and Australia, and they come when I talk to them, they all offer the same reasons for why they want to be in France, which is they feel that the produce is exceptional here, which it is. Many of them also want the exigence of having either studied in French culinary school and or working in a French kitchen, because they feel that the seriousness and the drilling of that experience is hugely important. And they also want the challenge of cooking for a Parisian clientele, because they feel that there's a depth, a passion for, and a depth of knowledge, a gastronomic literacy in Paris that's unique among other major cities in the world. So for me, some people were threatened by it. I mean, the largest number of foreign chefs and most influential in Paris are Japanese. The French were not threatened by the Japanese, because there's a reciprocal, they recognize themselves in each other. Those two countries and cultures love each other. But the influx of other foreign chefs was disruptive. But I think the French should be flattered, and I think I'm very, very glad they're all here.
Well, I kind of arrived when there was sort of that decline of French cooking, and there was a lot of discussion about frozen food and so forth. And I'd come from California, where we have this beautiful produce. And so I was sort of pointing out, I was like, oh, well, what's going on here? Blah, blah, blah. And people were like, what do you know? And then a few years later, French people started seeing what they were in danger of losing. So I often tell people, like, you have to go, wait for me to finish the sentence. But the French were influenced by us. And I said, but we were influenced by the French. Like I learned to cook like the French when I was in California. So, but your point about these chefs coming to France now and succeeding these young people from other places, I think it's also because French people or Parisians are much more open to trying new things. They'll try like a Korean restaurant, as long as it's not too spicy. But especially the younger people, they don't have these preconceived notions anymore. But so this is a question that,
I think it's a great generation. I think, a lot of a younger generation of French, the children of the Baba Cool, or the French hippies, to their parents' astonishment, grew up really liking the United States. They've traveled in the US, they adore Brooklyn, they love San Francisco, and they've spent a lot of time in the US, and they see that working and traveling there, and they came back, and that's why there's this explosion of American comfort food in Paris.
What's up with all these hamburger places? There's like a lot of,
but also lobster rolls, and I feel badly that America is the gateway through which a lot of Mexican food is becoming better known in Paris. But no, it's great. It's absolutely fantastic, and I think that you're absolutely right. I think that there is a curiosity, and the whole idea, a certain rigidness has relaxed. I mean, I talk about how when the first apartment I lived in Paris, I was invited to lunch occasionally on Sundays by my landlady, who was a countess, French countess who'd grown up in Morocco, and to titillate me one time. I mean, she was an unbelievably good cook. But she confided in me that the reason her blanquette de veau was so good is that she put a teeny bit of pickled lemon in it, which is something you should never do. And and that was a whole thing, that you never ever would toy with a canonical recipe like a blanquette de veau. Now people do whatever they like, and so, I think, frankly, we eat better in Paris today than we did when I first moved here. And, all those years ago, I think that I think you're right. I think that there was a dip in the 90s. I think that, for reasons economic and otherwise, but I think that where we are today, just before people are able to visit Paris and come see us, when they get here, they'll be delighted by how good the food is in Paris right now.
Yeah, and how well, there's this whole image that people in France don't like tourists and they don't like Americans. I'm like, no, everybody wants everybody to come back. Not everybody, maybe 3/4 of the other, it's kind of nice having less people in the city, but.
Well, you'll appreciate this. I mean, this morning when I had to go to the post office, and going to the post office here is a 5-step walk for me. And it's only open for 3 hours in the morning in this little village where I am. And every time I go there and open the door, the postmistress looks up and says to me, "C'est notre Américain, vous allez bien?"
You're the.
Our American, and at once I find it so charming. It's moving to me because it's acknowledging our difference, but by saying that there, you are our American. They're actually, I've heard from other people, like the builders who are doing renovation stuff on this house. They also, they're really proud of the fact that they have an American living in their village, and they talk about you, and they say, um, that you're doing a beautiful job renovating that house, and that you write for these big newspapers in places like New York.
Yeah.
It's very, very flattering.
Well, in my neighborhood, like when you move in France, it takes like a year for people to talk to you. It's like the hazing. So I had a difficult transition because I had to get the hazing.
I'm sorry, I thought you
Like
said
the
the
bizutage. So you have to learn, the rules, who to, which butcher to go to, which bakery, and they have to get to know you. And now that I've been here, I own the neighborhood. Like I know everyone on the street. I know what everyone's doing. I know all the gossip. People come to me for the gossip. So I'm the reference now.
Become the concierge. You have become the concierge. The concierge from Connecticut. Okay.
Will you explain, actually, there's an expression in French called faire le gardien, or is it fait le gardien? Faire le gardien. Because in France, people have, maybe you should explain it, because you had a guardian in your building and you talk about her in the book,
Yeah.
and they're always women, and they wear smocks and they run the show.
Yeah, I did have a concierge, a malevolent Portuguese woman who made my life hell in the most imaginative of ways for all the years that I lived in the Rue du Bac, in a tiny but charming apartment next door to the couvent de la Médaille Miraculeuse. So I tell people I basically lived in the Grande Épicerie. It was this sort of like a psychological arm wrestling thing where and it wasn't just me, it was everybody. I mean, I would come across her sorting through the garbage, reading letters, looking at people's phone bills that have been torn in half.
If they don't like you, you don't get your mail.
Or your mail's wet. It's always wet because I always thought to myself, she must have had a bucket inside of her loge where she would soak the mail of the people that she didn't like.
So when we say the word, for people that are watching, the word concierge means sort of guardian. It's the person, it's not like the concierge who makes restaurant reservations for you.
Like a superintendent in the New York City apartment building, the person who's there to look after things and who distributes the mail and cleans the staircase and everything else, and also keeps everybody in check with a system of social discipline and vicious gossip.
When I moved into my last building where we had one, I just moved to Paris, and my friend said, tip her right away. And I said, well, she hasn't done anything. I'm just going to hand her money. And they said, you got to tip her right away. So one day she had let the electrician in when I wasn't there. So I gave her some cash, changed everything. And I kind of learned they're like vending machines. You have to keep putting money in. Like you give them a tip at Christmas, and like for 3 or 4 months after, they're really nice. And then as spring comes around, then you got to find a way to give them something. And a lot of people don't give them money and they don't get their mail. And
right. It is something that it is a waning tradition. A lot of buildings are as the concierges retire, a lot of buildings in Paris are now selling the concierges loges, and it was a moment in time, and a lot of people now feel that they no longer want to have somebody spying on them like a doorman or a superintendent day in and day out.
Well, before we get to Q&A, I have a few more questions for you.
Sure.
In your book, you talk about, one of my readers actually once wrote to me and she said, Paris, she goes, I used to live in Paris and it was a great city, but it can kick your ass. And you wrote about living in Paris, arriving as a young man, alone. And people have this romantic notion that, you're sitting in the park reading Proust and eating Madeleines, where it can be a tough place to live. And what made you had a lot of experiences here. What made Paris really grow on you? And when was that moment? Because I remember I had a moment when I realized I love living. Well, I like living here a lot. It's like New York is like Paris. Like people no one loves New York, but they wouldn't live anywhere else.
I love New York and I love Paris too. No, I think for me, when it was, I had, it was a specific moment where I mean, when you move to France, unlike Emily in Paris and all of the, the gauzy fairy tale stuff, there's a little bit of what it's like to actually move to a new place. But I would say to somebody, if you really want to see the reality of Parisian life, watch the series Call My Agent, because that's a better depiction of what Parisian life is actually like. The American version, whether it's Woody Allen or whoever it is always a little too sepia toned and treaclish for me. It's tough. I mean, it's a completely different set of manners. It's a new language. It's a whole type of different codes. I mean, they're right and wrong ways of doing absolutely everything. I always remember one time when I first moved in my first apartment, and it was a beautiful Indian summer afternoon. So I thought, well, I'll just take a chair out and sit in the gorgeous garden under the chestnut tree and read my book. And I'm reading my book, and then I kept hearing somebody knocking very violently on a window, and I'd look up and the curtains would close. And this kept happening. And finally, my landlord, the retired English diplomat who was the wife of the French, or the husband of the French countess, came downstairs and said to me, Alexander, one does not sit in the garden. The garden is ornamental. If you wish to read outside and take some fresh air, I suggest you go to the Luxembourg Gardens. And I thought to myself, this is insane. I mean, this beautiful garden, why wouldn't anybody want to sit? And I was dressed correctly. I wasn't making any noise. I mean, all of these things. I mean, there are hundreds of different codes like that about things you do, you do and don't,
And nature is meant to be looked at, not be in.
Not inhabited. This was not meant to be inhabited. And your presence is bruising the pleasure that other people in the building might have looking out their windows.
Now when I go to like New York or San Francisco, I can't walk on grass. Like I'll be at a park and like people will just cut across the grass. It's the fastest way. And I'm like walking all the way around. Everyone's like, where are you going?
You'll be shot or scolded. But when you said to me, when was that moment? I think it was, I had, and I was really good at ill-fated love affairs. That's another theme in my life. But the 2
in your
years,
book,
yeah, very much
in your
so.
book, yes.
The 2 years that I was involved with a surgeon, a bad Czech in Prague, I would often take the bus because I couldn't afford to fly all the time. And there was one morning, and the bus was a punishment. I mean, your tailbone was, almost powdered by the time you got back. And the floorboards, these were Czech buses, diesel buses, and the diesel fumes were leaking through the floorboards. Yeah. And it took 2 days to recover from that trip. But when I woke up that one summer morning, and we were, coming through, I think it was not the Porte Maillot, the Porte d'Anière, and we start, lumbering down the cobblestones avenues, and it was May, and it was so beautiful, and we were at stopped at a light, and I saw a florist setting up his stand, and clipping the flowers and putting them in zinc buckets and standing back to see how everything looked. And I was so moved by it, and I recognized and appreciated it. It didn't feel foreign to me. I thought this pride in the arts of daily life and this desire to create and live beauty, even in the details of life, is something I've absorbed and admire so deeply. And people say, why are you still here? And I say, daily life is daily life. But when I go to the post office, I walk down the street in Paris and I always see something I've never seen before, or I smell freshly baking bread, or it's the aesthetic richness of the city never stops nourishing me.
Well, one thing, people who are watching, Alec has a website. It's Alexander Lobrano, where he writes about different restaurants in Paris, a lot of off the beaten track places, not the usual suspects often. And also your book is available there as well, and more about you and your other books. So it's alexanderlobrano.com. But speaking of theater, you've talked about restaurants being, I love the descriptions you have of restaurants, where you're seated, how you're dressed. Because in America, we don't have those codes. Like the worst thing you have to, in America is you have to wear a tie to dinner, which, that's like the most horrible thing. But in France, there's even in like the smallest restaurant, there's codes of behavior that aren't meant to be like, occasions to be reprimanded, but sort of determine your experience, I should say. And can you talk about that a little, like what it's like to go to a restaurant, like why these things exist? And I just love when you talk about this stuff. So that's why I love your book.
What it is, this was another one of those moments where I finally understood, it was one of these breakthrough moments, which was when I understood, even on the weekend when I was first here and didn't know anyone, I would go out for long, lonely walks, that the long, lonely walks, if I stopped someplace to have something to eat, I had a better time if I looked halfway decent, Once I understood that the French consider themselves when they go out, even if it's, just to the corner to mail a letter, you're participating in public life, and that this is both a pleasure and a set of obligations, and that you want to look well. And this extends, of course, to restaurants too. I mean, I always think of one time when I was and I wrote about this in a piece about Paris brasseries on the website of David Pryor, who started a great new travel club. And it was a piece about Paris brasseries and going to the Au Pied du Cochon in the middle of the night and sitting next to this woman who watched me and a close friend of mine from New York. And we just met these two guys from Australia in some club, and we're eating oysters and having, drinks, which we certainly didn't need at 2:30 in the morning. And she was just enjoying this so much. And, then she suddenly, I knew she was listening to every word that we said. And she leaned over and asked me, she was at the table next, she asked me to pour her wine because a lady does not pour wine. So I poured her wine and it was empty. So I put the bottle upside down, and immediately she sort of waved her fingers at somebody else. And this great big guy, came over and she said, Mon cher Gaston, I need more. And so another bottle arrived. And then she said to me, before she left, she drank the other bottle of wine like at half an hour with her little white poodle in her pocketbook. And she leaned over to me and she said two things. The Australian with the red hair would be the better sex. And I think I'm sitting there gobsmacked. And the next thing she did was to plant a big smacker on my lips. And she said, and now you'll never forget me or this night in Paris. And there you go. It was true. This is, all these years later, it was like a party. It was like a public party. And the animation and the vivacity and the conviviality and the, not every restaurant is like that, but that's what I used to love about the brasseries. It really was like a great big spectacle, the dining room in a brasserie.
Well, it is funny, these social codes in France, because I don't like to get dressed in the morning. I like to wear pajamas when I'm having my coffee. And we were staying with some people out in the countryside, and I was wearing like pajama bottoms and a t-shirt for breakfast. And she looked at me, it was so correct. And she said, c'est très original. She said, you're very original, which is a great.
Censorious. I mean, it's politely censorious. Yeah. No, the French have a huge talent for being politely censorious. And the number of times that I was told, that most lethal of phrases, ça ne se fait pas. That is not done.
Oh.
And that could be how you've arranged a bouquet of flowers, or how you're cutting up, there's so many different things, like,
Yeah.
And with cheese tray, you never cut the nose of the cheese. You always whittle a little piece off from the side. I mean, the sans fait pas, I don't hear that much anymore because I've learned things, but that doesn't mean that I won't hear them again, at some future point in time.
The other day we were leaving the house and to go somewhere, and Roman was wearing like these funky shorts with drawstring and like socks and sandals and his fanny pack and his little baseball cap. And I had like a shirt on with black pants and like tasteful sneakers. He goes, "I'm dressed like the American and you're dressed like the French person now." So I think we should get to some questions, because I'm sure we have some really great ones. And I'm going to look in the Q&A, and Laura.
Yes, hello. So we have a couple of requests for restaurant recommendations. So one from David for favorite Asian restaurant, and another for a favorite vegetarian restaurant. But I also wondered, Alec, if you wanted to talk a little bit about the little black book in your book. I want those recommendations.
At the very, there's a appendix in the back of my book with my 30 favorite Paris restaurants. It's pretty hard to whittle it down, but on the other hand, most people don't stay in Paris for more than a week. And so I tried to offer a variety of restaurants for different occasions. I mean, one of the hardest things, I think, one of the questions I get asked most often, and I'm very, very sympathetic to it, is people want to have one special meal when they come to Paris. And given the shocking expense of going to some of these restaurants, they don't want to make a mistake. So that's a really, that's a really tough question, because
they're like $1,000 for two people.
Well, easily. Yeah. And, the dollar has weakened considerably this year. And that's a hard question to answer, because I could give you advice, David, because I know you so well, but it's a tough thing, and I take it really seriously insofar as strangers are concerned. There are some very good vegetarian restaurants in Paris right now. I mean, that is something that's changed hugely. And I think that almost everywhere now, the old chestnut on vegetarian dining in Paris used to be, go to an Asian restaurant or go to whatever places like that. But now there are actually some very good places. I mean, for me, the fun ones that are not necessarily vegetarian are the fantastic new Israeli restaurants that have opened in Paris, where you can have, just brilliant modern Israeli food. And one of them just won a Michelin star, and it's also one of the funnest restaurants in Paris right now. And at some point, hopefully before we sign off, I'll remember the name of that place. The vegetarian, and what was the other one? Vegetarian. Asian. Asian is a really broad thing. What does France do really well? There's some really interesting Asian inflected food being cooked in Paris right now. I like this new restaurant called Brigade du Tigre, and it's two French guys. One of them lived in Malaysia for a long time, and the other one is his best friend, and they traveled in Asia for a long time, and they've come back, and they're incredibly talented cooks, and they're doing a pan-Asian menu that runs from a little off-center and a little French, but like wild mushroom ravioli and barbecued pork belly with pak choy and Hokkaido pumpkin. I think Brigade du Tigre is really good, and I also like Le Servan. Le Servan is a restaurant that's run by a young woman named and two sisters, the Leva sisters. One of them is the wife of Bertrand Godot of Septime, and they grew up, their background is half Filipino, half Polish, and they cook delicious Asian food. Absolutely unbelievably delicious Asian food. Would I go to Chinatown? Chinatown being the 13th arrondissement in Paris. I think the Chinese neighborhood, or the traditional Asian neighborhood in Paris, is aging out in a strange way. A lot of those restaurants were founded by quote, boat people who ended up in France at the end of the Vietnamese War. Many of them were very educated people who only opened restaurants, were more accustomed to being cooked for than cooking for other people. I don't have a favorite there anymore. I think that the individual contemporary Asian foods, like the two places I just mentioned, again, Brigade du Tigre, Brigade of the Tiger, or Le Servant, which is Servan. Those are two of my favorites.
I would like to throw out the Hood, which is a coffee shop, Singaporean restaurant. And they have this dish called the chicken rice lah, Lah. And I don't know what they do to this rice, but it is awesome. And it's all I want to eat. They make their own sriracha sauce. They make laksa. It's spicy. It's authentic. They deliver to the Singaporean neighborhood out by Wasi, the airport. I was like, why do you deliver them? They're like, it's a lot of Singaporeans. And as for vegetarian food, I agree with Alec. A lot of restaurants, if you go to like Septime or Verjus, you can just call them ahead and say, can we get a restaurant or menu without meat? And they'll do it gladly. They won't just throw on extra vegetables. I ate at La Belle Ordinaire yesterday for lunch, and then one of the 3 entrees was vegetarian. So it's become a lot easier to get vegetarian food, and you won't get sneered at either. Years ago, I had some friends from California who are vegetarians. They went to a vegetarian restaurant and they came back and I said, how was it? They go, well, it was interesting, but they didn't have any vegetables on the menu.
Well, so it was, they were pretty dire, the vegetarian restaurant. They were punitive. It's sort of like food that I imagine might be served in a monastery if the monks had misbehaved. It was like the old hippie food.
So a couple of our guests have mentioned that the Israeli restaurant is called Shabur.
Thank you.
Okay.
So you mentioned sort of people wanting that sort of special meal if they're going to splash out. What are your favorites that are less than sort of €200 a person?
I very much like, there's a woman named Stephanie Lekelec, and she's opened a new restaurant, sort of a supper club style restaurant that's in the 8th near a lot of the hotels. She's 2 stars. She used to work at one of the big fancy hotels. Her food is absolutely delicious. And it's a fun experience. It's not stuffy. Right now there's I think we're as we come out of the pandemic in Paris, I think we're going to see a lot of major changes to the food landscape here. I think that there'll be a moving away from traditional 2- and 3-star Michelin type dining. I just think it's become absolutely unaffordable. It's not what people want. For a long time, the hotels all thought that they needed a 2- or 3-star restaurant, but with there isn't one anymore at the Shangri-La. They closed it at the Hotel de Crillon. These people who are daring to go out and do a sort of a special occasion restaurant like Stephanie Lekelec, I really respect them and I really support it, because we'll always want to go somewhere special for a good meal.
I do kind of, I went to a venue the other day that was reopening, and they were doing all these like concept things. And I won't elaborate too much because I don't want to call them out. But it was a very expensive place. I was going to a press pre-opening, and I was just kind of wondering, like, after the pandemic, are people going to want these sort of concepts experience, or they just want to go out and eat something good and not have to,
Well, I think you're right, David. I think that as a friend of mine, a chef, said to me the other day, cooking isn't rocket science. It's a pleasure, and it's something you can learn and get better at all the time. People have been cooking nonstop for a year and a half. A lot of people are cooking who didn't ever really cook. They had no choice. Everybody had to cook. I think our desires and our expectations will be different as we start going back into restaurants. I think things that are too fussy or too cerebral, I think that there will be sort of a pushback against that. Sometimes I read menus and you can read, there's like, 200 words description of a dish and you still have no idea what it is. I tell chef friends, don't do that. say what it is. I mean, all this gauzy poetry around it. Let the poetry exist on the plate. That's what will be the surprise. Don't put all this verbiage there. You're just hiding your own talent.
It's funny because after the lockdown last spring, all I wanted to do was go out and have steak frite and a carafe of red wine and a frisee salad. It's like, that was all I thought about for 3 months. And that's really all we want. I don't want a little plate with all these things on it.
Yeah. Italy stuff. I'm desperate for a good steak tartare, which is something that is, there is a place down here in the market in Nîmes that does an exceptional one. But the one that I'm craving in Paris is that Le Bon Georges, that bistro in the 9th arrondissement. And Benoit, the owner, who's a great guy, English-speaking guy, who amazingly enough used to work for the Campbell Soup Company. He does one of the best steak tartares in Paris. And as soon as I hop out of the train next week, I'm going to make
a reservation there soon.
Oh, do you? Yeah. I can't wait to eat steak tartare. And it's so my response to that, the what will we be hungry for after, now that restaurants are reopening? I agree with you. I think that I'm craving steak tartare. I'm craving, like a good saule meunière. I'm craving the really basic, French classic things. I don't want pickled hibiscus flowers or just thank you. No.
Yeah.
I'm reading the questions too, sorry.
Yeah, a couple of guests have questions that are sort of follow-ons to your comments, Alec, about sort of the code of conduct in restaurants. And if I summarize both of them, I would say they're looking for advice on how, as tourists, they can avoid being impacted by that as much as possible. Like, how do they make sure that they can still get a good table, that they're, treated well, even though they're tourists, not locals?
I'm reading those questions now. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Again, I would say that one thing you have to accept is that the balance of power in a restaurant in France is still in the kitchen. I mean, coming from North America, where the customer is always right, we have this idea that, I'm the customer, so I have the right to have it the way that I like it. So, for example, I could go to a restaurant and say, well, I'd like to have the trout amandine, but I don't want it made with trout. I want it with salmon, and hold the almonds, and I don't want any butter used on it. And I just steam the salmon and then put some tomato, I rewrite the recipe is what I'm saying. If you have dietary issues, for example, any kind, celiac or whatever it might be, let them know before you show up. You also really do have to make an effort. I mean, I'm not saying I don't wear ties anymore. I hope I never wear a tie ever again. The world has become more comfortable and more informal. But one of the things I have learned to do since I've lived in France is to dress well and be comfortable. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time on it because it's not particularly interesting to me, but it does have a huge impact on the way that you are perceived of when you walk through the door. You have to have a reservation. You should be there on time with the reservation. And, I think that's also the serving style. You want to engage whoever it is who's waiting on you, saying, there's a little bit of chatter and you can exchange, I've been looking forward all day long to eating X, Y, and Z, or is there anything in particular? Or do you have a suggestion about the wine? I mean, once you've indicated your interest, and sometimes also explain why you're in the restaurant, why, we've been looking forward to coming here because we've read that X, Y, and Z. Once you engage with someone and they like you and they respect that you care about food and have made this journey to eat well and learn more about French food and have the pleasure of being in Paris, that'll change everything.
I should add that French people are exigeant, which means that they're very discerning. I used to say discriminating, and that has a different meaning in English. Roman was like, no, it's not about discrimination, but French people will say, I don't like that table, or can we sit over there? Whereas we're Americans, we go into a French restaurant, everyone's speaking French, you might not speak French well, and you don't want to say, could we not sit by the bathroom? And so you sort of have to be, once again, as Alex said, you're always going to be at a disadvantage because if you don't speak French, you're in a foreign country. So someone's knocking at my door, which is people knock on my door all the time. But so it's good to say something, say, well, this isn't what we thought it would be. Would you mind, like Alex said, if you have a food allergy, don't demand something, but say, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I can't eat dairy. And that's a good way to sort of, make friends with everybody. And I also tell people, go back to the same place over and over again, because once they get to know you, they'll treat you better the next time. Americans were taught not to complain, but we're also taught to be nice to everybody no matter what. And that's not necessarily the case in France.
There's a very good suggestion that's just flashed on the screen here. Actually,
nice shoes, yeah.
Yeah, the nice shoes. I mean, and nice shoes, and maybe for ladies, if you are the type of a woman who carries a handbag, a good handbag. I mean, all of these things do. It exasperates me to some degree because I just don't attach that much importance to appearances. But the French do, and it's important to respect that.
Yeah.
Sorry about it.
I would also say for women, the very simple red or simple makeup and a strong red lip. A little farther.
And being a woman, well, never mind.
We could go on for another hour about that part, all that. So one last question. What are your favorite cities to eat in besides Paris?
LA.
In France.
In France. In France, my favorite city right now, aside from Paris, is Marseille. I think that I've always loved Marseille. Marseille, the first time that I went as a spindly, impoverished student traveling overnight by train from London, the food landscape there was strange. It was still a pretty brawny port town. There was a lot of Italian food. There was a lot of North African food. There was bouillabaisse, bad bouillabaisse for the tourists. The city has changed. It's been renovated enormously. People often still avoid Marseille, but it is the capital of Provence. They're great new hotels, and it's becoming a preferred place for young chefs to open restaurants. They love it there because the rents are low, the tourism is booming. Other young creatives are moving into Marseille to create a market for what they're doing. And it is an incredibly diverse and inclusive city with people living there from every country in the world. I mean, it's sort of like New York on the Mediterranean. I adore Marseille.
Julia Child lived there too.
I was just going to say that. Yeah. Yeah. So cool. All right. That is all we have time for today. I would strongly encourage those of you who still wanted some restaurant recommendations, please check out Alex's website, alexanderlobrano.com. Check out David's website, davidlebovitz.com. David's website that has been there since what, David, 1998. So you have
1999.
99. Okay. So you have lots and lots of recommendations, and also both of them get out and about on Instagram. And so those are great resources to bookmark all the places that they go to that you want to visit yourself. Thank you so much, David and Alec. Thank you everyone for joining us. Alec, congratulations on your wonderful book. It's been a pleasure to host you and just listen.
And again, if I might, many people have been asking me for signed books, and the logistics of that, since I'm in France, are complicated. You have signed books.
We do,
so anyone
yes.
would like a signed book for a present, please order the signed book from Booklarder in Seattle. And if there was some special occasion, I've maybe foolishly said that anybody who wanted a special dedication could write to me through my website, and I will mail you a book plate dedicated to your friend or your aunt or whoever it might be. I think that it's been my pleasure to be hosted tonight by Booklarder, which is one of the best, great gastronomic bookstores in the world.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That's very generous. Thank you. All right. I hope both of you have a lovely evening. I'm going to go get on with sort of the rest of my day. And,
I'm going to go yell at that person that was knocking on my door.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to let my son start running up the stairs again and, all those things. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Alec, congratulations on the book.
Congratulations on the book, Alec.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and
Okay.
healthy. Bye.